growing up in a modest suburban home. The world of high society seemed like a dream, a glossy fantasy sketched out in the vibrant hues of magazine covers and glamorous films. We weren't poor, but we were certainly far from the opulence that lay just a few neighborhoods away. I remember quiet drives through the wealthier districts, gazing out the window in silent wonder. I saw a different kind of life through those iron gates and sprawling, manicured lawns. Even as a child, I could sense the separateness of that world, and I craved entry into it like an invitation to an enchanted realm. My fascination with wealth didn't start with a longing for possessions. It wasn't just the crystal chandeliers, the gleaming swimming pools, or the elaborate wardrobes. It was the sense of belonging to something extraordinary. There was power in those walls, in those grand estates. They held a promise, a life that was admired, respected, even envied. Perhaps I was young, naive. But what else was I supposed to think? In every direction, high society gleamed like a beacon of success, a badge of having made it. And part of me believed that if I could just enter that world, I might somehow transform into someone better. Someone deserving of admiration. Someone who had transcended the plainness of her beginnings. As I grew older, that allure didn't fade. In fact, it intensified. In high school and later in college, I made friends who invited me to homes where maids answered doors and chefs prepared meals. I was introduced to the children of executives, the offspring of privilege. And I watched with envy as they floated effortlessly through life, carrying their polished last names like shields. While I scrambled for scholarships and worked part-time jobs, they had careers handed to them on silver platters. They didn't struggle, didn't doubt. To them, the future was a series of opulent doors, each opening without resistance. It was around this time that I began to understand that in high society, wealth was more than just comfort, it was a kind of security. Money meant freedom from ordinary worries, freedom from the constraints that held people like me in place. And when I was introduced to Marcus at a charity event, I believed I had found my key to that freedom. Marcus was, by all accounts, the embodiment of everything I had once gazed at through iron gates. He came from one of those families that held silent influence, the kind you only hear about in whispers. His family's name appeared on donation plaques in museums, embossed on buildings, and whispered in circles of influence. At the time, he seemed gentle, even kind. He was confident in a way that only comes from being raised in luxury. And he took an interest in me. To me, he was more than just a man, he was my bridge to another world. He was my promise of escape, my access to a life I could barely imagine. When we began dating, I was swept into an existence where indulgence was second nature. Our dates were celebrations of decadence. He would take me to restaurants where waiters wore tuxedos and wines came with pedigrees. He introduced me to people who smiled easily, people who lived in a realm far removed from my own, where every face seemed perfectly composed, every conversation a series of polished, practiced exchanges. But even in those early days, there was a sense of underlying performance. I noticed it in the way I spoke, choosing my words carefully, pretending to know about obscure art pieces and gourmet delicacies I had never encountered before. And Marcus didn't mind, he encouraged me to adapt, to refine myself. In his eyes, I sensed an expectation, an unspoken demand for perfection. Still, I told myself this was the price of belonging. If I could learn, if I could adapt, then maybe I could fully claim this life as my own. Marcus was my guide, my mentor in this grand re-education. With him, I learned to navigate social circles, to dress in a way that whispered sophistication, to mimic the effortless grace of his world. As our relationship deepened, the allure of high society grew even stronger. It wasn't just Marcus that pulled me in, but the lifestyle itself. Weekends in vineyard estates, invitations to fundraisers where people in designer suits discussed charity work with detached enthusiasm, vacations where no expense was spared. I started to lose myself in this gilded life, as if shedding the old, plain version of myself like an outdated skin. Every day, I felt myself drifting further from my past, closer to this strange, glittering world of wealth and exclusivity. The reality, of course, was that high society was nothing like I had imagined. There was no fairy tale waiting for me, no warmth behind the polished exteriors. But I didn't know that then. I saw only the sparkle, only the surface. And in my eyes, it was radiant. With Marcus at my side, I felt like someone worth noticing, someone important. And so, when he proposed to me in a meticulously planned moment under the stars, with a ring so large it seemed designed to be noticed, I said yes. I believed that saying yes was my entry ticket, my permanent pass into the life I had always dreamed of, the life I thought would bring me fulfillment. I didn't yet realize that, in so many ways, I was agreeing to become an actor in a play, one in which appearances were everything, and love, if it existed at all, was merely a pleasant subplot. With Marcus, life quickly became an extravagant spectacle, an endless series of dates and gatherings that felt more like curated experiences than genuine connections. He had a way of making everything feel deliberate. Every outing a statement of affluence. Our dates moved from the usual dinners and walks to private events in the city and weekend excursions that whisked us away to picturesque locations. Each dripping with luxury. I was dazed by the whirl of it all. Too captivated to question anything. Marcus knew exactly how to dazzle. He brought me to high-rise lounges, where city lights sparkled like scattered jewels. To exclusive art exhibitions, where we sipped rare champagne. And to weekend trips in private cabins on secluded lakes, where staff attended to our every need. And I was all too happy to play my part dressing in designer outfits he bought for me. Learning to laugh in the right places. Perfecting an aura of poise and sophistication. He seemed proud to show me off. Introducing me to influential friends and colleagues who watched me with a measured politeness. As if assessing whether I could truly fit into their world. But beneath the glimmer of these outings, there was something colder. An expectation I could never quite put into words. Marcus rarely showed any real vulnerability. Conversations between us rarely delved into anything intimate. He was guarded. Almost rehearsed. It was as if he wasn't dating a woman but auditioning a partner who would enhance his own image. Someone who could seamlessly slot into the life he had been groomed to uphold. I became his companion. Yes. But also an accessory. A piece of the grand puzzle that was his carefully curated life. The first time I noticed this shift was at a party hosted by one of his friends. A lavish affair at a sprawling mansion filled with golden lights and the faint smell of expensive perfume. As we moved through the crowd, Marcus introduced me as the woman who would soon complete the image. It struck me like a splash of cold water. His words seemed harmless on the surface, but they echoed in my mind. Complete the image. I could feel the eyes of his friends on me. Approving. Observing. Assessing. I realized then that I wasn't just Marcus's date, I was the next step in the equation of his success. A visual testament to his stability. Maturity. And, perhaps, his family's demands. And yet, I brushed it aside. I told myself it was all part of the process. After all, I was stepping into a world where everything was designed to impress. I convinced myself that my doubts were simply growing pains. That I would learn to belong in time. If I had to play the role of the perfect partner, then I would play it well. As the months went by, I adapted to this life of extravagance. I learned to move with the elegance expected of me. Nodding at the right conversations. Feigning interest in discussions about international investments. Rare wines. And summer homes in European cities. Marcus continued to lavish me with gifts, a bracelet that cost more than my car. Designer handbags. And clothes that hung in my closet like ornaments in a museum. I wore each one with pride. Feeling my old self fade with each new acquisition. Each party. Each glimpse into this surreal life. But there were times when I would glance in the mirror and barely recognize myself. I was polished. Poised. The reflection of someone who looked ready for magazine covers. But it felt like I was wrapped in a costume. There was a growing hollowness to the life I was living. A realization that the price of luxury was to conceal my own doubts and needs beneath layers of fabric and jewelry. I wasn't the only one who noticed. At another gathering, a woman, a friend of Marcus's family, I believe, pulled me aside. She smiled with a warmth that seemed out of place. Her eyes flickering over me with an odd mix of pity and curiosity. You know, she said. Her voice low. This life. It can be demanding. Especially for those who weren't born into it. I smiled and nodded. Too polite to question her further. But her words lingered. That night, as Marcus and I drove home in silence, I felt the weight of her observation settling over me. I could feel the edges of the role I had to play pressing in. Shaping me. It wasn't love that held Marcus and me together, it was an agreement. A silent pact of expectations that I had entered. Partly out of choice. Partly out of a sense of resignation. Yet I stayed. I stayed because leaving felt impossible. Because each outing, each trip, each display of wealth was like a hook that sank deeper into me. I couldn't let go of the image of myself I had created. The woman of taste and refinement. The girl who once glanced longingly at mansions had become a resident of those mansions. And I felt bound to uphold this reality even if, deep down, I questioned whether I truly belonged. In time, Marcus proposed. Though the moment lacked the intimacy I had once fantasized about. He did it in the way that he did everything else, with polished grandeur. We were in a private garden, with lanterns glowing softly around us. And he presented the ring with a smile as flawless as a model's. It was beautiful. Massive. A piece meant to make statements at every social gathering to come. And so, I said yes. Though I barely recognized the voice that answered him. It sounded hollow. Distant. Like it belonged to someone else. Inside, a part of me trembled, wondering if I was making a mistake. But the lure of high society was too strong. The dream of being part of this elite circle too seductive. I silenced my doubts, telling myself that everything would work out. With that yes, I had secured my place in this world. My lifelong membership to high society. It was only after the proposal, when we were driving home, Then I felt an unsettling sense of finality settle over me. This was the life I had chosen, the life of luxury. Yes. But also the life of appearances. Of endless performances. And now I was bound to it. Committed to becoming the perfect partner. The ultimate accessory to Marcus's success. Our engagement marked the beginning of what felt like an orchestrated performance. Suddenly. It wasn't just Marcus and me anymore, it was us and everyone else's family. Our friends. Distant relatives. Even the social circles we had yet to enter. The wedding planning took on a life of its own. A grand spectacle that quickly spun out of our hands and into the control of people who knew exactly how it should look. Who should be there. And what they should say afterward. I quickly learned that my wedding was no longer my own. Marcus's mother. A woman of uncompromising taste and strong opinions. Insisted on guiding every decision. She introduced us to her own planners. Florists. And designers. As if she were building an art piece rather than celebrating a marriage. Marcus seemed unfazed by this takeover, he had always lived under her guidance. And he had learned early on that his mother's involvement was an unspoken requirement. The ceremony was to take place on a vast estate owned by one of Marcus's relatives. It was a place that felt more like a museum than a home. With rooms decked in antique furniture. Walls lined with portraits of solemn ancestors. And gardens manicured to the inch. It was beautiful. Yes. But sterile, like everything else in this world. My childhood dreams of a small, intimate wedding faded as the event swelled into something far grander than I had ever imagined. Or even wanted. I was swept into preparations that were more about perfection than sentiment. Dresses were chosen for their elegance rather than comfort. Guest lists were pruned and polished until only the finest remained. And the flowers alone had their own budget, a sum so large that it felt absurd. When I tried to make small suggestions, I was met with polite smiles or slight nods. But my ideas were rarely implemented. In this process, I was both the star and the spectator. Watching as my own wedding was designed around me. With me as the centerpiece. The closer we got to the date, the more I felt myself slipping into a role that felt foreign. Like a character in a play. Every time I looked at Marcus, I saw in him a sense of satisfaction. Even pride. He was unfazed by the grandeur. Used to it in ways I could never be. For him, the wedding was merely the culmination of a relationship built on expectations. A display of our stability and success. To him, we were fulfilling our duty to society. To his family's reputation. To the friends who would attend and take note of every detail. On the day of the wedding, I was prepared by a team of stylists. Each movement of their hands precise and rehearsed. I was dressed in a gown so elaborate it felt like a costume. Heavy with delicate lace and beads. My face perfectly composed with layers of makeup that felt like a mask. The woman in the mirror looked flawless. And yet as I stared at her, I felt the last of my identity slipping away. The ceremony itself was held outdoors. Beneath a canopy of pristine white fabric that glowed softly in the afternoon light. Rows of chairs stretched out before us. Filled with faces both familiar and strange. I was supposed to walk down the aisle with a smile. Basking in the admiration. But I felt oddly detached. As if I were watching from above. I could feel the eyes on me. Each one appraising. Each guest silently validating or questioning my place in this world. As I stood there beside Marcus. With our vows exchanged and our hands linked. I felt the weight of what I had chosen pressed down on me. The officiant's words floated over me. Lost in the buzz of my own thoughts. This was my life now. Bound to a man whose world was as distant to me as the stars. The moment felt hollow. But I forced myself to smile. To match Marcus's expression of poised satisfaction. I reminded myself that this was what I had wanted, that this was what I had worked so hard to achieve. The reception was a grand affair. The kind that only exists in carefully curated images. With gourmet dishes presented like art. A live orchestra. And towering floral arrangements that seemed to bloom just for us. I walked through the crowd. Accepting congratulations and best wishes from guests who barely knew me. To them, I was Marcus's wife now. And that title seemed to carry more weight than any part of my own identity. My family stood in a small cluster. Visibly out of place among the polished elite. Their warmth a stark contrast to the polished formality that surrounded us. Seeing them there. Watching me with proud yet uncertain smiles. Reminded me of the person I once was. The person I had left behind in my pursuit of this life. As the night wore on, I felt a growing sense of emptiness. I was surrounded by luxury. Encased in the splendor I had once craved. Yet I felt isolated. Like a piece of fine china displayed in a cabinet. I saw Marcus mingling with guests. His hand resting on my shoulder occasionally as if to reassure our audience that we were the perfect couple. But there was no warmth in his touch. No sense of connection. To him, I was simply his partner in this charade. His equal in status. His wife by name alone. The hours slipped by in a blur of handshakes. Smiles. And conversations that felt meaningless. The music played on. The glasses clinked. And people danced in the glow of chandeliers. I was surrounded by people. Yet I had never felt more alone. It was as if I were living in a world built entirely of surfaces. A world where every emotion was muted. Every gesture controlled. Every word calculated. By the time the last guest left and the lights dimmed, I felt like a hollow version of myself. The room emptied, leaving only Marcus and me in the echoing silence of our new reality. As he led me to the car that would take us to our honeymoon, he looked at me with a small smile. One that seemed to say, "We did it." He looked satisfied. Content. As if we had achieved something monumental. But I felt none of that satisfaction. In that moment, I realized that I had entered into something far more profound than a marriage. I had entered a contract. A binding agreement to live in a world that demanded perfection. A world that left no room for true intimacy or understanding. I had become part of an image. A carefully constructed facade that would need constant maintenance. A life where love and connection were secondary to appearances. And as the car sped away, leaving behind the grand estate and the traces of our grand spectacle, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever find my way back to myself. I was Marcus's wife now. Yes. But I was also a stranger to my own life. The girl who had once dreamed of belonging to high society had been replaced by a woman trapped within it. After the wedding, I found myself cast in a role that seemed pre-written. As though my life were following a script that had been handed to me on my wedding day. I became Mrs. Marcus Hall. A title that seemed to carry more weight than my actual name. The days that followed were filled with rituals and routines. Each one reinforcing my place as Marcus's wife. A position that felt strangely distant from being his partner. We moved into a sprawling mansion. One that I had visited briefly before, but never explored. Now, it was my home, a beautiful, polished place that felt more like a museum than a sanctuary. The mansion had rooms that seemed to exist solely for display. There were grand sitting rooms with couches so delicate they looked like they'd disintegrate under the weight of a single cushion. Dining rooms that could host 20 guests comfortably. And a library filled with pristine, leather-bound volumes that no one had ever read. The walls were adorned with portraits of Marcus's ancestors. Solemn faces that watched over us with unyielding judgment. As if guarding the legacy I had now become a part of. Walking through the rooms, I felt like an intruder. Like someone who had stepped into a stranger's house and could be asked to leave at any moment. Life became a series of events, obligations, and social gatherings. We hosted dinners where every detail was meticulously arranged by a team of staff. Each course timed with military precision. Each guest carefully chosen from a list that had been curated long before I entered the picture. There were charity events, galas, and luncheons with other women in the social circle. Many of whom shared my experience of marrying into wealth. Conversations were polished, polite, and devoid of any depth. We spoke about art exhibitions, new designers, and vacation plans. But never about anything that truly mattered. The unspoken rule was to keep everything light, uncontroversial, and perfectly pleasant. I learned quickly that my primary role was to represent our marriage with grace, elegance, and restraint. There were expectations for how I dressed, how I behaved, even how I spoke. The women in our circle dressed in muted tones. Each outfit carefully selected to convey sophistication without drawing too much attention. We wore jewels that were tasteful but never ostentatious. And makeup that enhanced without overshadowing. Even my gestures became more controlled. My laughter subdued. Every part of me was tailored to fit this life. Marcus's family watched over me with the same critical eye that had overseen our wedding. His mother, who seemed to carry an endless supply of social advice, would often pull me aside with gentle corrections. "Your posture is lovely," she'd say. "But remember to keep your chin a little higher. It gives a sense of confidence." Or, "You handled that conversation well. Though a little more laughter might make you seem warmer." At first, I tried to accept her guidance graciously, telling myself that she only wanted to help me succeed in a world I didn't fully understand. But over time, her words began to feel less like advice and more like reminders of my place. In the midst of these expectations, I became acutely aware of my isolation. My family, the few friends I had left from before my marriage, and even my own interests seemed to fade into the background. When I did manage to call an old friend or visit my family, the conversations felt strained, as if they didn't know how to relate to me anymore. They asked about my life with polite curiosity, as if I were living in a distant land, somewhere they couldn't reach. And in many ways, I was. The things that once defined me, my laughter, my hobbies, my spontaneity, all seemed to have no place here. Even my relationship with Marcus settled into a rhythm that felt more like an arrangement than a marriage. He was always polite, always composed. But there was a distance between us that I couldn't bridge. Our conversations were often about logistics, upcoming events, social obligations, financial matters. We rarely spoke about anything personal. Never delved into feelings or dreams. It was as if he had decided that I, like everything else in his life, was a piece to be placed within a carefully constructed puzzle. And I had agreed to be that piece. Nights in the mansion were quiet. Almost hauntingly so. I would lie awake, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the house around me. Sometimes I wandered through the rooms, my footsteps muffled by the plush carpets, my shadow stretching across the dimly lit walls. It felt like walking through a mausoleum, a place built to preserve a certain image, a certain legacy, but devoid of real warmth. The mansion had everything anyone could ever want. Yet it was empty. A place of walls and wealth without any sense of home. One day, while wandering, I found myself in a small room tucked away at the back of the house. A room that seemed untouched by the decorator's hands. There were faded curtains, an old armchair, and a stack of books that had yellowed with age. It was a simple room, far removed from the grandeur of the rest of the house. And in its quiet simplicity, I felt an odd sense of comfort. I began to spend more time there, reading through the forgotten books, sitting in the worn armchair, savoring the solitude. It became my refuge, a place where I could shed the polished exterior and just be. In those moments alone, I would think about the life I had left behind, the dreams I had once held. I wondered what had happened to that young woman who had longed for luxury, who had believed that wealth could transform her into someone remarkable. I realized that in my pursuit of status, I had lost something far more precious: my sense of self. I was no longer that girl who had looked at mansions with awe. I was a woman who lived in one and felt like a stranger. My isolation grew, thickening around me like a fog. And the small acts of rebellion I could manage spending time in that forgotten room, reading books no one else would see, became the only things that grounded me. I was a showpiece. Yes. A symbol of Marcus's success. His partner in the social charade. And I was beginning to understand just how hollow that role truly was. As the days passed, I felt a sense of entrapment. A quiet desperation that simmered beneath my calm exterior. I had everything I had once wanted. Yet I felt more alone than ever. I was living a life that looked beautiful from the outside but felt barren within. The girl who had craved high society had disappeared. And in her place was a woman who had learned the cost of that world's allure. And so I stayed, playing my role, moving through the motions, wondering if I would ever find a way out. If there was even an exit from the life I had chosen. I had stepped into a world of wealth. But it had come with chains of its own. Chains that I wasn't sure I could break. The realization came gradually, creeping in like a chill I couldn't shake. The life I was living, with its gilded walls and manicured grounds, wasn't a dream, it was a kind of beautiful prison. The more I tried to fit the mold expected of me, the more I felt myself slipping into an empty shell. A figure built to be admired but never known. It was a slow erosion of my spirit. And I could feel it in every quiet moment, every hollow conversation, every smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. One evening, as I sat at yet another charity gala, I found myself lost in the glitter of chandeliers, the soft murmur of distant laughter, the carefully polite exchanges happening around me. These events had become a staple of our marriage. As familiar as they were meaningless. Marcus was at my side, wearing his usual expression of composed detachment, as he shook hands and exchanged pleasantries with guests whose names I could barely remember. I watched him, realizing that we were like actors, each performing our parts in a social play that required only our presence and our smiles. It was a small thing that broke me. An offhand comment from an older woman with silver hair and a glint of pity in her eyes. She leaned over, a soft, conspiratorial smile on her lips, and whispered, "You play your part well, dear. It's not an easy role, but you wear it beautifully." She winked as if she'd offered me a compliment, as if her words held some hidden wisdom. I smiled politely, but inside, her words echoed with a painful truth. I was a performer, a symbol, a part of a system designed to preserve appearances, to present a front of perfection to a world that never looked too closely. When we returned home that night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling in our vast, silent bedroom, the shadows stretching around me like the bars of a cage. I could hear Marcus breathing beside me, his presence both familiar and foreign. The space between us felt insurmountable, an invisible wall built of secrets, expectations, and the silent knowledge that our marriage was a function, not a connection. We lay side by side, bound together in every visible way, yet separated by a gulf neither of us seemed willing to cross. The next morning, I felt an impulse to escape, if only for a few hours. I dressed quickly, leaving a note for Marcus that I would be out and needed some time to myself. He never questioned these absences, perhaps because he too enjoyed the reprieve they provided. I drove without direction, letting the road unwind before me, the sprawling estates and manicured lawns gradually giving way to simpler streets, to neighborhoods filled with small shops and cafes. There was a rawness here, a sense of life unfiltered by wealth, and it comforted me in ways I couldn't explain. I stopped at a small cafe, one that had no polished facade, no air of exclusivity. I ordered a simple coffee, feeling oddly liberated as I sat by the window, watching people pass by, each face unique, each expression unguarded. There were families, couples, friends laughing together, and strangers exchanging brief glances, sharing the smallest fragments of life without pretension. I envied them. Envied their freedom to simply be themselves without the weight of appearances. As I sat there, I found myself longing for a life that wasn't built on wealth or status. A life where I could be seen for who I was, rather than what I represented. I wanted to strip away the layers of artifice. To return to a simpler existence where happiness wasn't measured in possessions or reputation, but in moments of genuine connection. I wanted a life that was real. A life where love and friendship were things I could feel, not just display. The hours slipped by as I sat in that cafe, lost in my thoughts, feeling the sharp contrast between the small, simple place and the grand, empty mansion waiting for me. By the time I returned home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the house's sprawling lawn. I felt a pang of reluctance as I walked through the doors, as if stepping back into a role I could no longer convincingly play. The mansion loomed around me, silent and beautiful, yet utterly devoid of warmth. It felt like a vast, empty shell, a monument to a life that looked perfect from the outside but was hollow within. In the days that followed, I found myself slipping deeper into disillusionment. The life I had once coveted now seemed like a burden. A series of demands I could no longer meet without feeling a quiet sense of despair. I attended events, hosted dinners, wore the dresses and jewels that had once excited me. But there was no joy in it. Every smile, every laugh felt like an act, a performance for an audience that would never truly see me. Even my small refuge in the forgotten room felt like a reminder of my entrapment. A space where I could escape for a moment but never truly leave. One evening, while standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the jewels around my neck, I caught my own gaze, staring back at me with a look of unfamiliarity. The woman in the mirror was beautiful. Yes. But she was also a stranger. A carefully constructed image of someone I had once dreamed of becoming but now barely recognized. I felt a pang of grief. A sense of loss for the woman I had once been. For the life I had left behind in pursuit of a fantasy that had turned into a nightmare. The hardest part was the loneliness. Despite the people surrounding me, the parties, the gatherings, I felt profoundly alone. As if I were drifting through a world that didn't truly want me. I was a guest in my own life. A spectator watching from a distance. Too afraid to break free, yet unable to fully belong. The people in our social circle were polite, always eager to exchange pleasantries. But there was no real warmth. No true friendship. Our relationships were built on convenience, on mutual benefit, on the silent understanding that we were all playing a part. I began to withdraw, retreating into myself, finding solace only in my own thoughts and the fleeting moments of solitude I could steal away. Marcus noticed. Of course. But he said nothing. Perhaps he too felt the emptiness, though I doubted he would ever admit it. He had been born into this world, groomed for it. And to him, this was simply life as he had always known it. For him, marriage was a function, a necessary component of his image. And as long as I fulfilled my role, he was content to let things remain as they were. But I could feel myself changing. A quiet rebellion brewing within me. The longer I lived this life, the more I realized that I could not endure it indefinitely. The costs of high society were too great. The sacrifices too profound. I had traded my freedom for luxury, my authenticity for a role. And now I was beginning to understand the true price of that exchange. There were moments when I found myself contemplating escape, not in a physical sense, perhaps, but in a way that would allow me to reclaim some part of myself. To find a path that felt real and meaningful. I didn't know how or when I would break free. But I knew that I could no longer continue on this path. That something within me was shifting, preparing to rise. And so, in the quiet moments, in the spaces between obligations, I began to nurture that part of myself that yearned for freedom. I let myself dream, if only for a moment, of a life outside this carefully constructed world. A life where I could be more than a showpiece, more than Marcus's wife. I didn't yet know what that life would look like. But I knew that, for the first time, I was ready to begin searching for it. As the days passed, the weight of my disillusionment became harder to ignore. And I felt a quiet but persistent need to reclaim something real. The luxury that had once seemed enchanting now felt stifling. Every event, every interaction filled with artifice and expectation. I moved through life like a ghost, floating from one obligation to the next. Outwardly composed, but inwardly restless. Beneath my polished surface, a quiet rebellion was brewing, a yearning to break free. Even if only in small ways. It was one of those bright autumn afternoons. The air crisp with the faint smell of leaves and a sense of change. Then I found myself wandering through the city alone. Marcus was away on business. And our social calendar was clear for the day. I took the opportunity to escape. To slip away from the estate and lose myself in the city. A place that felt alive and vibrant in ways the mansion never could. Walking through the streets, I felt an unexpected sense of liberation. The ordinary world around me filled with an energy that was at once foreign and deeply comforting. I found myself drawn to an art gallery nestled on a quiet street. A modest place without the grandiosity I had come to expect from the galleries in our circle. Inside, there were no polished patrons. No whispered conversations about prices or prestige. Instead, there was only art, simple, powerful, raw. The pieces were rough, unrefined. Yet they held a beauty that felt more real than anything I had seen in years. I stood there, gazing at a painting of a lonely road winding through a vast, open landscape, feeling a strange sense of kinship with its emptiness, its quiet resilience. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a connection. A spark of something that was neither polished nor perfect, but entirely genuine. It was as if the art spoke to a part of me I had buried long ago. A part that yearned for authenticity. For freedom. I wandered the gallery for hours, losing myself in each piece, letting my guard down in a way I hadn't dared to in years. In that small, unassuming space, I felt a flicker of something I could barely recognize: hope. When I finally left the gallery, I carried that feeling with me. A fragile sense of purpose that I knew I needed to protect. It was small, barely a whisper in the noise of my life. But it was there, growing stronger with each step. As I walked back through the streets, I began to understand that if I wanted a different life, a life that felt real and meaningful, I would have to make it for myself. I could no longer wait for something to change on its own. I had to be the one to take that first step. Back at the mansion, I retreated to my little sanctuary. That forgotten room where I could shed the expectations and simply be. I sat in the worn armchair, letting the silence wash over me, feeling the weight of my choices pressing down. I realized that if I wanted to find freedom, I would have to confront the reality of my marriage, the life I had chosen, the sacrifices I had made. It was a daunting thought. A path that promised neither certainty nor safety. But for the first time, I felt ready to face it. In the days that followed, I began to make small changes. Subtle acts of defiance that reminded me of the person I had once been. I started reading more. Books I had never had time for in the flurry of social events and obligations. I took long walks in the gardens, lingering by the edges where the wildflowers grew untamed. A contrast to the carefully manicured lawns that stretched before the house. I even reached out to an old friend. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who knew me before I had become Mrs. Marcus Hall. Our conversation was simple, unremarkable in most ways. But it felt like a lifeline. A reminder of a world outside the one I was trapped in. We spoke about ordinary things: her job, her family, her small but fulfilling life, and I felt a pang of longing. An ache for the kind of freedom she possessed without even realizing it. She asked about my life, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. And for a moment, I was tempted to tell her everything. To let her see the reality behind the polished surface. But I held back, smiling as I described the beautiful house, the events, the life that looked so perfect from the outside. I could sense that she knew there was more, that she could see through the cracks. But she didn't press. Instead, she wished me well, her voice soft and kind. And as we said goodbye, I felt a surge of gratitude for her, for the reminder that somewhere beyond the walls of my life, there were people who knew me, who saw me. With each small act of rebellion, each moment of solitude, I began to feel a sense of inner strength, a resolve I had never known before. I realized that while I couldn't change my circumstances overnight, I could begin to reclaim parts of myself. Little by little, piece by piece, I could choose to live more authentically, to find ways to break free from the expectations that had once defined me. It was a quiet journey, one that required patience, resilience, and a willingness to face the truth. I knew that my life with Marcus, my place in high society, would continue to demand my presence, my adherence to its rules. But I also knew that I no longer had to be defined by it. I could exist within that world without losing myself to it. I could find freedom in the small moments, the quiet acts of rebellion that reminded me of who I was beneath the layers of artifice. And so, I began to live for those moments, to seek them out with a quiet determination. I found solace in simplicity, in the little things that brought me joy: an afternoon spent reading, a walk through the garden, a day in the city where I could blend into the world, unseen and free. These moments became my anchors, grounding me in a life that had once felt like a dream but now felt like a carefully crafted cage. In time, I realized that my strength didn't come from breaking free of high society, but from finding a way to exist within it without losing myself. I didn't need to abandon my life with Marcus. Didn't need to escape in some grand gesture. I simply needed to hold on to the parts of myself that mattered. To nurture the small, quiet voice within me that longed for freedom, for authenticity, for something real. And as I settled into this new sense of resolve, I felt a quiet peace, a sense of purpose that had once eluded me. I had chosen this life. Yes. But now, I was choosing to live it on my own terms. To find meaning in the small acts of defiance that reminded me of who I was. I would remain in this world. But I would no longer let it consume me. I would find freedom in the spaces between. In the moments of solitude. In the choices that were mine alone. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of control. A glimmer of hope that perhaps I could create a life that was both beautiful and real. And in that quiet realization, I found my own strength. My own resolve, a way forward that was mine and mine alone. As winter approached, the quiet acts of rebellion and small moments of solitude I had come to cherish grew in importance. They became like stepping stones. Each one leading me closer to a place where I could finally make a decision. A choice that felt right and true. My life with Marcus was as outwardly perfect as ever. A seamless presentation of wealth and harmony. But inside, I felt the strain of pretending. Of playing my part in a world that no longer held me captive. The turning point came on a cold December evening. At one of the many holiday parties we hosted for the season. The mansion was filled with guests. Each one dressed to perfection. Their voices a harmonious blend of laughter, praise, and gentle gossip. I stood near the grand fireplace, smiling and nodding in time to a conversation about summer homes. While the familiar feeling of detachment washed over me. A sense that I was watching the scene unfold from a distance. Marcus was at my side. His hand resting lightly on my shoulder as he engaged our guests with practiced charm. But when I looked at him, I no longer felt the warmth I had once mistaken for love. I saw only a man who had made me his partner in a life of status. A man who cared deeply about the image we presented but knew nothing of my heart. I realized then that I could no longer pretend. Could no longer live in the shallow waters of a life that felt as artificial as the decorations around me. In that moment, a quiet certainty settled over me. I knew what I had to do. The path forward was frightening, uncertain, and filled with potential loss. But it was a path that I knew I needed to walk if I wanted to find myself again. I was ready to let go. To walk away from the mansion. The parties. The endless obligations. I was ready to trade wealth for freedom. Luxury for authenticity. And a life built on appearances for one rooted in truth. The days that followed were filled with quiet preparations. Each one a step toward reclaiming my life. I met with a lawyer. A man who understood discretion. And began the paperwork for a separation. There was no anger in the decision. No resentment, only a quiet resolve. A desire to begin again on my own terms. I knew that leaving Marcus would come at a cost. That I would be stepping away from the comfort and security his world provided. But I also knew that I could no longer live as a showpiece. An accessory in someone else's life. When I finally told Marcus, his reaction was one of muted surprise. He didn't argue. Didn't plead. Instead, he simply nodded. His expression calm. Even understanding. As if he had been expecting this all along. Perhaps he, too, had felt the emptiness. The quiet unraveling of our marriage. Perhaps he, too, understood that we had been living a life that was beautiful only from the outside. In his own way. Marcus respected my choice. And for that, I felt a small glimmer of gratitude. Packing my belongings was a bittersweet task. A reminder of the life I was leaving behind. A life that had once seemed so alluring and now felt like a distant dream. I moved through the mansion, gathering pieces of my past. Carefully choosing what to take with me and what to leave behind. There were dresses, shoes, and jewels that I no longer recognized as my own. Objects that had been given to me to play a role I no longer wished to play. But there were also pieces that held meaning, books I had read in my small sanctuary. Letters from friends and family. Mementos of a simpler time when I had lived with more honesty and freedom. I packed them carefully. Each one a reminder of the person I was determined to become again. The person I had lost in my pursuit of high society. When the day came to leave, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. The mansion stood behind me. Beautiful and imposing. A symbol of the life I was leaving behind. I took one last look. Not with regret, but with a sense of closure. A final farewell to a chapter of my life that had taught me more than I had ever expected. I wasn't leaving with bitterness, I was leaving with clarity. With an understanding that my happiness could only be found in a life that was my own. The drive away from the mansion felt surreal. A strange blend of sadness and relief. An overwhelming sense of possibility mingling with the faint ache of what I was leaving behind. I was stepping into an unknown future. A life filled with uncertainty, but also with the promise of something real. Something true. I was choosing a path that would demand resilience, courage, and patience. But it was a path that felt right. In the weeks that followed, I settled into a small apartment in the city. A modest space that felt both unfamiliar and comforting. It was far from the grandeur of the mansion. But it was mine. I decorated it with pieces that held meaning. With books and art that spoke to me. With plants and small treasures that brought me joy. It was a place of warmth and simplicity. A home that reflected the life I wanted to build, one that was unencumbered by expectations. Free from the weight of status. Each day, I found small ways to reconnect with myself. to rediscover the parts of me that had been lost in the pursuit of wealth and admiration. I spent my mornings in quiet contemplation, my afternoons exploring the city, meeting new people who saw me not as Marcus's wife, but as an individual. I began to nurture friendships, real connections built on shared experiences, on laughter and understanding. These people knew nothing of my past, nothing of the life I had left behind. And that was a relief. A freedom I had longed for without realizing it. Slowly, I began to rebuild, to piece together a life that was imperfect but filled with meaning. I took a job at a local art gallery, a place where the focus was on creativity, on expression, on beauty that came from the heart rather than the bank. I found joy in the work, in the simplicity of each day, in the freedom to be myself without reservation. It was a life far removed from the one I had once dreamed of. But it was a life that felt honest. A life that felt like my own. Looking back, I didn't regret my time in high society. Nor did I resent Marcus or the choices that had led me into that world. In many ways, that life had been a necessary journey. A path that had taught me the true meaning of wealth. The real value of freedom. I had learned that happiness couldn't be bought. That love couldn't be constructed. That a life built on appearances would always be empty. In the end, I had found my way out. Not by running or rebelling, but by choosing to live with honesty. With integrity. With a commitment to myself. I had broken away from high society. Yes. But more than that. I had broken free from the illusions that had once held me captive. I had found a life of my own. A life that was humble, simple, and filled with a quiet kind of joy. And as I looked out over the city from my small apartment, I felt a sense of peace. A sense of contentment that I had once thought could only be found in the mansions of high society. I had discovered that the life I had once craved was a mirage. A beautiful but hollow vision. In letting go of that life, I had found something far more precious, a life that was real. A life that was mine.